Welcome back to HFY Soundscape, the best channel for HFY sci-fi tales.
Silence is a lie on the frontier. Most people think the edge of the galaxy is quiet, but they've never heard the way the red dust of Oros 4 screams when a vacuum-sealed landing craft tears through the atmosphere. Silas Thorne didn't need an early warning system. He felt the vibration in his marrow before the sound even hit his ears. He was a man who had spent 15 years in the Terran shock corps, a man who had seen stars blink out of existence, and yet, as he stood on his porch holding a rusted hydro wrench, his heart did something it hadn't done in a decade. It hammered. Silas wasn't supposed to be found. Oros 4 was a graveyard of a planet, a place of jagged obsidian cliffs and bioluminescent moss that smelled like ozone and old copper. He had built his life here on a foundation of solitude. His home was a reinforced bunker disguised as a farmhouse, tucked away in a valley where the winds howled loud enough to drown out even the loudest memories of the Great Expansion War. But as the streak of silver fire cut across the violet sky, Silas knew the universe was done letting him hide. The ship didn't land, it arrived. It was a jagged obsidian needle that defied the laws of aerodynamics, hovering inches above his withered crop of fire wheat. The heat from its engines turned the red soil into glass instantly. Silas dropped the wrench. He didn't reach for his pulse rifle, not yet. If they wanted him dead, they would have fired from orbit. No, this was something else. This was a message. The hatch hissed, a sound like a dying serpent. White vapor poured out, obscuring the ground, and then a figure stepped through the mist. Silas froze. He had fought Krill, negotiated with the hive minds of Centauri, and shared drinks with outlawed cyborgs, but he had never seen anything like this. She was tall, nearly 7 feet of sculpted lethal elegance. Her skin had the faint, iridescent shimmer of a nebula, and her eyes were a piercing, glowing gold that seemed to track the very electricity in his nervous system. She wore armor that looked less like metal and more like folded shadows, etched with runes that vibrated with a faint, low-frequency hum. This was Xylara, the Empress of the Void-Shatter Legions, the woman who had single-handedly conquered 3 star systems before she reached her 20th cycle. To the rest of the galaxy, she was a goddess of war. To Silas, she was the last person he ever expected to see on his doorstep. Hold on before we get into the real stuff, I want to know. What are you doing at this exact moment while hearing my voice? I love seeing your answers down below in the comments. Xylara didn't move toward him with a weapon. She didn't shout commands. She simply stood there, her golden eyes scanning his weathered face, his calloused hands, and the humble life he had built from nothing. The tension in the air was so thick it felt like it might ignite. Silas gripped the porch railing, his knuckles white. "Silas Thorne," she said. Her voice wasn't a scream or a growl. It was a melodic resonance that seemed to vibrate directly inside his skull. The Butcher of Black Sun. The man who broke the unbreakable blockade. Silas narrowed his eyes, his voice gravelly from years of disuse. "That man died 5 years ago, Your Majesty. I'm just a farmer now. I grow wheat that tastes like dirt, and I fix machines that want to stay broken. You've wasted your fuel." Xylara took a step forward, the ground beneath her boots cracking. A small, faint smile played at the corners of her lips, a smile that held more danger than a legion of warships. "I did not come for the butcher," she whispered, her gaze dropping to the small handmade wooden pendant hanging from Silas's neck. "I came for the only man in the 7th sector who knows how to fix a soul." Silas felt a cold chill wash over him. He realized then that she wasn't breathing heavily from the flight. She was trembling, just slightly. The most powerful warrior in the known universe was terrified, and she had traveled across the void to find a retired soldier on a dead planet because of a secret he thought he'd taken to his grave. "I don't do that anymore," Silas said, his voice dropping an octave. "Go back to your throne, Xylara." She reached up slowly and unlatched the collar of her shadow armor. As the plating fell away, Silas gasped. Beneath the indestructible exterior, Her chest was glowing with a fractured, pulsing violet light, a core leak. She was dying. And she wasn't just dying. She was carrying a payload that could vaporize the entire star system if it went critical. "You have 1 hour, Silas," she said, her voice finally breaking. "Before I become the spark that ends this world." The silence that followed Xylara revelation was heavier than the gravity of a neutron star. Silas stared at the pulsing violet fracture in her chest, his mind racing through old schematics and battlefield triage protocols he had tried for years to forget. A core leak in a Void-Shatter Empress wasn't just a medical emergency. It was a localized supernova waiting to happen. If that containment field failed, Oros 4 wouldn't just be scorched. It would be erased from the star charts entirely. "Inside, now," Silas commanded, his voice regaining the iron authority of a sergeant. He didn't wait for her to agree. He turned and kicked open the heavy blast-shielded door of his cabin. Xylara stumbled. The feared goddess of 1,000 worlds actually faltered, her hand catching the doorframe, leaving a glowing, singed handprint on the synth wood. Silas caught her arm. Her skin felt like vibrating liquid mercury, searingly hot and terrifyingly smooth, and hauled her toward his workbench. This wasn't a medical suite. It was a grease-stained table covered in dismantled tractor parts and soldering irons. "Lie down," he barked, clearing a pile of gears with a violent sweep of his arm. Xylara collapsed onto the metal surface, her shadow armor clattering. Up close, the beauty people whispered about across the quadrants was haunting. She wasn't just attractive in a conventional sense. She was predatory and celestial, her features sharp enough to cut glass, her hair like spun starlight flowing over the dark workbench. But her golden eyes were clouded now, flickering like a dying power grid. "Why me, Xylara?" Silas hissed, ripping open a floor panel to reveal a hidden stash of military-grade tech he'd kept just in case. "Your empire has the best surgeons in the galaxy. You have bio-architects who can regrow a heart from a single cell." She let out a ragged laugh that sounded like shifting tectonic plates. "My surgeons are loyal to the throne, Silas, not to me. If they saw the Empress failing, they would harvest my core to power their next coup before my heart even stopped beating. I needed someone who hates the Empire. Someone who understands what it means to be a weapon that's tired of killing." Silas pulled out a stabilizer rig, an illegal piece of tech he'd scavenged from a crashed scout ship years ago. His hands, usually rock steady when fixing a harvester, were beginning to sweat. He was looking at a prime singularity core embedded in a living chest. One wrong move with his atmospheric welder, and he'd be the man who accidentally ended the sector. "You're a fool," Silas muttered, hovering the glowing blue tip of the stabilizer over the violet fracture. "Coming here was a suicide mission. I was already dead the moment the core cracked," she whispered, her gaze locking onto his. "I chose to die near the only honest man I ever met. Even if that man was the one who shot me 5 years ago." Silas froze. The blue light of the stabilizer reflected in his eyes. The memory hit him like a physical blow, the siege of the obsidian gate. He had been the one to fire the experimental ion lance. He had seen her fall from the ramparts. He thought he had missed her vitals. He hadn't. He had started the slow burn that was killing her right now. "You knew," Silas whispered. "You knew it was me." "I never forget a face that refuses to flinch," she said, her breathing becoming shallow. Suddenly, the cabin lights flickered and died. Outside, the sky turned a bruised, angry purple. The ship Xylara's obsidian needle began to emit a high-pitched whine that shattered the windows of the farmhouse. "They're here," Xylara gasped, clutching Silas's forearm with a strength that threatened to snap his bone. "Who?" Silas asked, reaching for the pulse rifle hidden under the bench. "My high guard," she choked out. "They didn't come to rescue me, Silas. They followed the leak. They're here to ensure the Empress dies, and to make sure there are no witnesses to her weakness." A shadow fell over the doorway. It wasn't the sun setting. It was a drop pod, slamming into his front yard with the force of a kinetic strike. The impact of the drop pod sent a shockwave through the floorboards that nearly knocked Silas off his feet. Dust rained from the ceiling, settling on Xyla's iridescent skin like gray snow. Outside, the rhythmic thud-thud of heavy combat boots hitting the red clay echoed through the valley. These weren't scouts. These were the Void-Shatter Praetorians, gene-forged killers designed for one purpose: absolute removal of any threat to the Empire's image. How many? Silas growled, his hands flying across the stabilizer rig, trying to bypass the safety protocols that were currently locked by Xyla's fading biosignature. A full squad, Xylara wheezed, her golden eyes fluttering. 12, perhaps 15. They carried disintegrator rifles. Silas, leave me. Take your scout ship. The one hidden beneath the hydroponics bay. Silas paused, his finger hovering over a glowing red override button. He hadn't told anyone about that ship. Not even the black market traders who came once a year to buy his surplus fireweed. You've been tracking me for a long time, haven't you? I keep my enemies close, she whispered, a faint, bloody smirk touching her lips. And my legends, closer, a voice boomed from outside, amplified by a sonic projector that made the cabin's remaining glass shards dance on the floor. Sergeant Silas Thorne, you are in possession of Imperial property. Relinquish the Empress, and your death will be swift. Resist, and we will glass this entire sector. Silas looked at the woman on his workbench. She was the most dangerous being in the galaxy, a woman who had ordered the destruction of worlds. But right now, she was just a patient on his table, leaking violet energy that smelled like burnt ozone. He reached under the bench and pulled out a heavy, matte black case. He flipped the latches. Inside lay a Vanguard 7 inches pulse repeater, a weapon he had sworn never to prime again. Property? Silas muttered, slamming a fresh power cell into the rifle's housing. The weapon hummed to life, a low, predatory growl that matched the look in his eyes. I've never been big on sharing my tools. He turned back to the stabilizer rig. Xylara, I'm going to vent the excess pressure from your core. It's going to feel like someone is pouring molten lead into your veins. If you scream, they'll know exactly where to aim their heavy ordnance. Can you handle that? She gripped the edges of the metal table, her knuckles turning a translucent white. I have survived the heart of a collapsing star, Sergeant. Do your work. Silas didn't hesitate. He slammed his palm onto the override. A jet of violet gas hissed out of the fracture in her chest, striking the ceiling and melting through the reinforced synthwood like a hot knife through butter. Xylara's body arched, her eyes rolling back, but she didn't make a sound. The sheer willpower required to stay silent while her internal systems recalibrated was nothing short of superhuman. The stabilization was holding, but only just. The countdown on the rig showed 42 minutes until the core reached critical mass again. Suddenly, the front door of the cabin didn't just open, it vanished. A concentrated beam of thermal energy vaporized the wood and the shielding, leaving a glowing, molten rectangular hole. Through the smoke stepped a Praetorian, clad in white and gold power armor, his visor a cold, emotionless slit of blue light. He raised his rifle, aiming directly at Silas's head. The Empress is compromised, the soldier stated, his voice a mechanical drone. Execution protocol, Alpha. Silas didn't flinch. He didn't even look up from the rig. You're on my farm, son, Silas said softly. And you didn't wipe your boots. Before the soldier could pull the trigger, Silas kicked a hidden lever beneath the workbench. A concealed sentry turret, built from scavenged harvester parts and illegal railgun magnets, swiveled from the rafters and fired a single hypervelocity slug. The Praetorian's chestplate imploded, and he was hurled back out into the red dust. But Silas knew the real fight hadn't even started. The sky outside was darkening, and the sound of more drop pods whistling through the air told him one thing. They weren't just here for the Empress. They were here to make sure no human ever remembered her name. Stay still, Silas told Xylara, grabbing his pulse repeater and moving toward the shattered doorway. I've got chores to finish. As he stepped out into the biting wind of Oros 4, he saw them. 12 more Praetorians, fanning out in a lethal semicircle, their weapons glowing with the light of a dozen tiny suns. And standing in the center was their commander, holding a device that was blinking with a rhythmic, ominous red light. "He's got a detonator," Xylara voice echoed in Silas's earpiece, weak but urgent. "If he loses his biosignal, the ship in orbit drops a kinetic slug." "He's the failsafe." Silas looked at the commander, then at the dying Empress behind him, and then at the red soil he had spent 5 years tilling. He realized he couldn't just shoot his way out of this one. He needed a miracle, or he needed to do something so spectacularly human that the machines in front of him wouldn't see it coming. The commander of the Praetorians didn't move. He stood like a golden statue against the bruised purple horizon of Oros 4, the detonator in his hand pulsing like a digital heartbeat. Silas could feel the eyes of the other 11 soldiers locking onto his center of mass. In the vacuum of the frontier, a standoff wasn't a conversation. It was a countdown. "Sergeant Thorne," the commander's voice was amplified, sounding like grinding tectonic plates. "You were a hero of the Sol defense. Why die for a sovereign who viewed your species as nothing more than biological shielding? Step aside. Let the Empress's core reach its natural conclusion. We will leave this rock intact. You have my word." Silas spat into the red dust, his grip tightening on the pulse repeater. "The last time an Imperial gave me his word, I lost half my platoon in the trenches of Titan. I think I'll stick to my own code today." Behind him, inside the cabin, the low hum of the stabilizer rig spiked into a frantic, high-pitched whine. Xylara was losing time. The violet gas venting from her chest was beginning to crystallize in the air, creating shimmering, lethal shards of pure energy that danced around the room. "The human sentimentality is a glitch," the commander remarked, raising his arm. The 12 Praetorians leveled their rifles in perfect unison. "Fire!" Silas didn't dive for cover. He didn't have time. Instead, he slammed his hand into the remote trigger on his belted device he used to synchronize his automated harvester drones. Suddenly, the ground beneath the Praetorians erupted. Silas hadn't just been farming fire wheat for 5 years. He had been burying surplus seismic charges along the perimeter of his property to ward off the giant rock vorms of Oros 4. The explosion wasn't a fireball. It was a localized gravity distortion. The red soil liquefied, turning into a churning whirlpool of clay and stone. 3 of the Praetorians were sucked downward as the earth gave way, their power armor grinding against the pressurized silt. Silas used the chaos. He lunged behind a reinforced titanium grain silo, the air around him sizzling as disintegrator beams tore through the space he had occupied milliseconds before. Crack, crack, crack. Silas leaned out and fired 3 bursts from his pulse repeater. The blue bolts slammed into the lead Praetorians' kinetic shields, overloading them in a shower of white sparks. "Xylara!" Silas shouted over the roar of the wind and the whine of the ship above. "Can you move?" "I am." "Functional," her voice crackled in his ear, strained and tight. "But the core is rejecting the stabilization. Silas, the commander. He has a phase shifter. Your projectiles won't touch him." Silas looked toward the commander. The gold-clad officer was walking calmly through the crossfire, his body flickering in and out of reality like a ghost in a broken transmission. Every bolt Silas fired passed harmlessly through the commander's chest, hitting the dirt behind him. He was a phantom of destruction, closing the distance with terrifying deliberateness. 30 minutes, Silas, Xylara whispered. Before the system-wide reset, the commander reached the edge of the porch, his phase shifter humming with a sickly green light. He looked at the cabin, then back at Silas. "You fought for a dying empire once, Sergeant. Now you fight for a dying woman. You truly are a glutton for lost causes." The commander raised his hand, and the air around the farmhouse began to ripple. He wasn't just going to shoot Silas. He was going to collapse the local spacetime around the cabin, crushing everything inside into a singularity. Silas looked at the grain silo next to him. It wasn't just filled with wheat. It was filled with highly combustible, nitrogen-rich fertilizer, the kind needed to grow anything in this dead soil. "I've always liked the underdogs," Silas muttered. He aimed his rifle not at the commander, but at the base of the silo. If he timed this wrong, he was vapor. If he timed it right, well, he'd still probably be vapor, but he'd take the ghost with him. But just as his finger tightened on the trigger, a shadow fell over the battlefield that was even darker than the Imperial ship. The dual suns of Oros 4 were eclipsed by something massive, something that hadn't been on the scanners. A second ship, ancient and rusted, looking like a graveyard of fused metal, descended from the clouds. It wasn't Imperial. It wasn't human. "Silas," Xylara's voice came through, sounding genuinely shocked for the first time. "That's a Ravager-class scavenger vessel. They don't track Empress cores. They track bounties." The commander froze, his phase shifter flickering. The Ravager ship began to deploy harpoon cables, thick as redwood trees, aimed directly at the Imperial ship hovering above. The hunters had just become the hunted, and Silas was caught in the middle of a three-way war for the most valuable woman in the galaxy. The arrival of the Ravager vessel turned the battlefield into a kaleidoscope of chaos. These weren't soldiers. They were scavengers of the deep void, creatures and outcasts who lived in the radiation shadows of dying stars. Their ship was a jagged mountain of rusted hull plates and stolen engines, and it didn't care about Imperial protocol. Massive harpoon cables, glowing with magnetic disruption fields, slammed into the hull of Xylara's obsidian needle. The screech of metal on metal was loud enough to make Silas's ears bleed. The Imperial ship groaned, its anti-gravity stabilizers failing as the Ravagers began to winch it toward the ground like a harpooned whale. "The vultures have arrived," Xylara's voice was a ragged whisper in Silas's ear. "They don't want me alive, Silas. They want the singularity core in my chest. To them, I am just a battery that can power a pirate moon for a century." The Praetorian commander hesitated. For a split second, his focus shifted from Silas to the sky. That was the only opening Silas needed. Silas didn't fire at the commander's flickering, phased body. Instead, he fired a sustained beam from his pulse repeater into the base of the nitrogen fertilizer silo. The metal groaned, the internal pressure spiking until the rivets popped like champagne corks. "Get down!" Silas roared, diving behind a stone irrigation trough. The explosion wasn't just fire. It was a white-hot wall of expanded gas and shrapnel. Because the commander was partially phased, the physical debris passed through him. But the thermal shockwave, the sheer kinetic energy of the atmosphere being displaced, ripped his phase shifter out of alignment. His golden armor flickered one last time and became solid. Silas was on him in a heartbeat. He didn't use his rifle. He used the momentum of his jump to tackle the commander, slamming him into the red mud. They rolled, a mess of high-tech ceramic plates and worn leather. Silas grabbed the commander's wrist, pinning the arm holding the detonator against a jagged rock. "I've spent 5 years digging holes in this dirt," Silas hissed, his face inches from the commander's cold blue visor. "I know exactly where the soft spots are." He slammed his elbow into the visor's neck joint, a move designed to sever the oxygen feed. The commander bucked, throwing Silas off, but the detonator skittered away into the tall, burning fire wheat. "The core is at 80%, Xylara's voice screamed in the comms. "Silas, the Ravagers are deploying boarding pods. If they breach the cabin, the containment field will collapse." Silas looked up. 3 rusted pods were screaming down from the scavenger ship, aimed directly at his roof. He looked at the commander, who was scrambling for his detonator, then at the burning wheat. He had 20 minutes, 1 dying Empress, a squad of elite killers, and a swarm of space pirates. Silas reached into his boot and pulled out a small, unassuming glass cylinder, a thermite acid charge he used for clearing stubborn boulders. He didn't throw it at the commander. He threw it at the ground between them, melting a hole straight into the planet's crust. "You want her?" Silas yelled over the roar of the Ravager engines. Come and get her through the basement. He turned and sprinted back toward the cabin, his boots heavy with the weight of a decision he knew he couldn't take back. As he crossed the threshold, he saw Xylara standing. She was leaning against the workbench, her skin glowing so brightly it was painful to look at. The violet light was leaking from her eyes now, illuminating the room in a ghostly rhythmic pulse. "Silas," she said, her voice sounding like two stones grinding together. "The Ravagers. They've locked onto my signature. If I stay here, your world dies with me. Then we're not staying here," Silas said, grabbing her arm and throwing it over his shoulder. He could feel the heat radiating off her armor, a fever that would melt a normal human. "We're going to the cellar." "The cellar?" Xylara coughed, a spray of iridescent blood hitting the floor. "What good is a hole in the ground against a starship?" "It's not a hole," Silas grinned, a grim, dangerous look that reminded her why he was the only man to ever survive an encounter with her legions. "It's a hangar." As the first Ravager boarding pod smashed through the roof of the kitchen, showering them in splinters and scrap metal, Silas kicked the release on the floorboards. They dropped into the darkness just as a harpoon claw retracted, taking the entire roof of the farmhouse with it. The darkness of the cellar didn't last long. As Silas and Xylara hit the hydraulic lift floor, banks of amber emergency lights flickered to life, illuminating the secret he had spent 5 years and every credit of his pension building. Beneath the humble farmhouse sat a sleek, needle-thin blockade runner, the Stray Volt. It was a ship built for one thing: getting out of places that didn't want you to leave. You kept a jump-capable vessel under a cornfield?" Xylara gasped, leaning heavily against the ship's cold, carbon fiber hull. Her violet glow reflected off the polished metal, making the hangar look like the inside of a dying star. "I'm a veteran, Xylara," Silas said, dragging her toward the boarding ramp. "We don't retire. We just wait for the next war to find us." Above them, the ceiling groaned. The Ravagers were tearing the farmhouse apart piece by piece, their heavy industrial cutters shrieking through the reinforced floorboards. Dust and debris rained down on the Stray Volt's cockpit. Through the gaps in the ceiling, Silas could see the massive, rusted belly of the Ravager ship hovering just 100 feet above his home. "Silas, wait." Xylara grabbed his collar, her strength surging for a fleeting second. "The core stabilization. It's failing. If we launch, the D-force will rupture the remaining seals. I'll go critical before we hit orbit." Silas looked at the diagnostic screen on the ramp. Core integrity, 12%. The timer was blinking red. They had 15 minutes before she became a human bomb. "I'm not just launching," Silas said, his fingers flying across the ship's external keypad. "I'm jump-starting you." He sprinted to a heavy locker at the back of the hangar and pulled out a pair of thick, insulated cables attached to a massive industrial capacitor, the kind used to power planetary defense grids. "You're going to use your ship's reactor to jumpstart my heart?" Xylara asked, a look of genuine disbelief crossing her celestial features. That's not science. That's madness. In my experience," Silas grunted, hauling the cables toward her. "Humanity's best work usually happens right on the edge of madness. Now, hold on to the railings. This is going to feel like being hit by a freight train." Above them, the cellar doors finally buckled. A Ravager boarding party, a nightmare collection of multi-limbed aliens and scavenged combat droids, dropped into the hangar. They hissed as they saw the ship, their mechanical eyes fixating on the glowing Empress. "Secure the battery." The lead Ravager croaked, raising a jagged scrap cannon. Silas didn't look at them. He slammed the first cable into the port on Xylaira's shadow armor and the second into the Stray Volt's main power bus. "Do it!" Xylara screamed. Silas hit the manual discharge. A blinding arc of white electricity jumped from the ship into Xylaira's chest. The roar of the power transfer drowned out the sound of the Ravager's weapons. Xylaira's body stiffened, her feet leaving the ground as she was suspended in a cage of pure lightning. The violet fracture in her chest flared white, then blue, then finally settled into a steady, pulsing gold. The shockwave from the discharge sent the Ravagers flying back into the hangar walls, their electronics fried instantly. Silas slammed the ramp closed and dove into the pilot's seat. "Hang on." He didn't wait for the hangar doors to open. He engaged the vertical thrusters at maximum burn. The stray volt didn't just rise, it erupted. It smashed through the remains of the farmhouse, through the Ravager boarding pods, and slammed directly into the underside of the massive scavenger ship. The impact was jarring, throwing Silas against his harness. Alarms screamed in the cockpit, but the stray volt was built for punishment. Its reinforced nose cone pierced the Ravager's rusted hull like a needle through silk. "We're inside their ship," Xylara shouted, stumbling into the co-pilot's chair, her eyes now a steady, burning gold. "Silas, why are we inside the enemy ship?" Silas gripped the flight sticks, a wild, determined grin on his face. "Because their shields are useless if we're under their skin. And because I want to see the look on that Praetorian commander's face when he realizes he's not the only one who can play Ghost." But as Silas prepared to fire the main engines and tear the Ravager's ship apart from the inside, the viewscreen flickered. A video transmission overrode their systems. It was the Praetorian commander, his visor cracked, standing on the surface of the planet below. He was holding the detonator again. "Sergeant Thorne," the commander's voice was cold and hollow, "you forgot one thing. I don't need to capture the Empress to win. I just need to make sure no one else has her. The orbital slug is locked onto the Ravager ship's current coordinates." "Goodbye, Sergeant." A streak of white light appeared in the upper atmosphere. The kinetic slug, a solid rod of tungsten traveling at Mach 20, was already on its way down. The cockpit of the stray volt turned into a cacophony of sirens. On the tactical overlay, the kinetic slug appeared as a vertical line of pure death, screaming down from the heavens. In less than 30 seconds, the Ravager ship and the stray volt pinned inside its belly would be reduced to a cloud of radioactive vapor. "Silas, the kinetic strike!" Xylara shouted, her hand slamming onto the console. "We have to disengage. If that rod hits the Ravager hull while we're docked, the shockwave will liquefy our bones." Silas's hands were a blur across the controls. "We can't disengage. The docking clamps on this junker are fused to our hull from the impact. If I try to back out now, I'll tear our engines right off the mounts." He looked up through the reinforced transparasteel. Above them, the interior of the Ravager ship was a labyrinth of rusted struts and leaking coolant pipes. The scavengers were scrambling, realizing too late that their prize had become a lightning rod for an orbital execution. "The core," Silas said, turning to Xylara. "How much power can you vent?" Xylara's golden eyes widened. "The jump start stabilized the fracture, but if I push the output, I'll blow the containment again. What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that tungsten rod is moving fast, but it's just a hunk of metal." Silas growled, slinging the ship's power to the forward deflectors. "If we hit it with a concentrated burst of singularity energy, we won't stop it, but we might deflect it. Just enough to turn a direct hit into a graze. You want me to use my life force as a localized gravity well?" Xylara asked, a strange, breathless laugh escaping her. "Sergeant, you truly are the most reckless creature in the galaxy. That's why they paid me the big credits," Silas retorted. "Do it." Now, Xylara stood in the center of the cockpit. She closed her eyes, and the air began to hum. The gold light in her chest shifted to a deep, royal violet once more, but this time it was controlled. She thrust her hands forward, and a beam of pure, distorted spacetime erupted from her palms, passing through the stray volt's nose cone and punching through the Ravager ship's upper decks. The kinetic slug hit the distortion field 3 miles above the planet. The impact sounded like the universe itself was snapping in half. The tungsten rod didn't shatter. It bent. The gravity well created by Xylara's core yanked the slug 5 degrees off its trajectory. Instead of piercing the heart of the Ravager ship, The rod tore through the scavenger's engine block and slammed into the red desert of Orosphore 5 miles away. The resulting explosion was like a small sun igniting on the horizon. A wall of dust and fire rolled across the landscape, vaporizing Silas's farm and sending a shockwave that flipped the Praetorian drop pods like toys. Inside the stray vault, the feedback was brutal. Xylara was thrown backward, her back hitting the bulkhead with a sickening thud. The ship's lights failed, plunged into a terrifying, sparking darkness. Xylara! Silas unbuckled and scrambled toward her. She was slumped against the wall, the glow in her chest dimming to a flickering ember. The iridescent shimmer of her skin was fading to a dull gray. Silas reached out, his hand trembling as he checked for a pulse. Don't look at me like that," she whispered, her eyes opening just a crack. "I'm an Empress. I don't die in a basement. Technically, we're in a pirate ship," Silas muttered, relief flooding his chest. Suddenly, the stray vault groaned. The Ravager ship, its engines destroyed by the kinetic slug's passage, was beginning to fall. Gravity was taking hold, pulling the massive, rusted mountain of metal down toward the surface of Orosphore. "Silas," Xylara gasped, pointing to the view screen. The Praetorian commander wasn't dead. His armor was scorched, his cape gone, but he was standing on a ridge overlooking the crash site. And he wasn't alone. 3 more Imperial cruisers were dropping out of hyperspace in high orbit. The commander hadn't just called in a strike. He had called in the fleet. "They're going to glass the planet," Silas realized, his heart sinking. "They don't want to take the risk of you surviving. They're going to burn everything." He looked at his ship, then at the dying woman, then at the sky full of Imperial fire. Silas Thorne had spent 5 years trying to find peace. Now he realized that peace was a luxury he could no longer afford. If he wanted to save the woman who had crashed into his life, he had to become the man he used to be. One last time. The descent was a violent symphony of screaming metal. The Ravager ship, now a graveyard of iron, was plummeting toward the jagged obsidian cliffs of Orosphore. Silas lunged back into the pilot's seat, his hands dancing across a console that was bleeding sparks. He had to time the disengage perfectly. If he stayed pinned to the scavenger ship for a second too long, he'd be crushed in the impact. If he let go too early, the falling debris would shred the stray vault like paper. "Xylara, I need you to lock into the inertial dampeners," Silas shouted over the roar of the atmospheric friction. "The Imperial fleet is charging their lances. We have exactly 4 minutes before they turn this hemisphere into a marble of molten glass." Xylara dragged herself into the co-pilot's chair, her movements stiff, like a rusted machine. Her golden eyes were dim, but the fire in them hadn't gone out. She plugged her neural interface directly into the ship's computer. "The fleet, it's the 3rd Division. Led by Admiral Valerius. He was my mentor. He won't hesitate to fire Silas. To him, an Empress who cannot defend herself is already a ghost." "Then let's give him something else to look at," Silas growled. He slammed the emergency release. The docking clamps exploded outward with a series of concussive thuds. The stray vault kicked back, tumbling through the wake of the falling Ravager vessel. Silas fought the stick, his muscles bulging as he pulled the ship out of a flat spin, just hundreds of feet above the ground. Behind them, the Ravager ship slammed into the obsidian cliffs. The explosion was absolute, a mountain of fire that lit up the purple sky, sending a mushroom cloud of debris miles into the air. Direct hit on the scavenger vessel. A cold, synthesized voice crackled over the open comms. It was the Praetorian commander, speaking from a secure channel. "Admiral Valerius, the target is grounded. Commencing planetary sterilization in T-minus 60 seconds. Silas looked up. In the darkening sky, 3 massive Imperial cruisers were aligning their ventral cannons. The air began to shimmer with blue ionized energy. They were preheating the orbital lances. "We can't outrun a light-speed lance, Silas," Xylara said softly, her hand resting on the console. "Even the ship isn't fast enough." "We're not running," Silas said, his voice dropping into a deadly calm register. "We're going up." Right through the eye of the needle. He flipped a series of switches he had installed for smuggling, the ghost drive. It didn't make the ship invisible, but it mimicked the thermal and magnetic signature of falling debris. To the Imperial scanners, the stray volt would look like just another piece of the Ravager ship bouncing off the atmosphere. "Silas, that's suicide," Xylara whispered. "If they catch a glimpse of our trajectory, they'll swat us like a fly." "Then don't let them look," Silas said. He reached into a hidden compartment and pulled out a small palm-sized device, a human-made feedback loop jammer. "This is old Terran tech. It doesn't block scanners, it echoes them. For every one of us they see, they'll see 1,000 ghosts." He slammed the throttle forward. The stray volt screamed as it defied gravity, shooting straight up through the thick black smoke of the crash site. On the ridge below, the Praetorian commander looked up, his sensors malfunctioning as 1,000 phantom signals erupted on his HUD. He hesitated for a single crucial second. Up in orbit, Admiral Valerius stared at his tactical display. "What is this? A debris field? No, it's a swarm. Fire the lances." The commander's voice screamed over the comms. "It's a trick." "The sergeant is," but it was too late. The stray volt burst through the upper atmosphere, the heat shield glowing white-hot. Silas didn't pull away from the fleet. He headed straight for the lead cruiser, the Eternal Wrath. "What are you doing?" Xylara cried, clutching the armrests as the massive hull of the cruiser filled the view screen. "The only place they won't fire a planetary lance," Silas yelled, "is at their own ship. We're going to dock in their main hangar. They'll kill us the moment we land." "Maybe," Silas said, a jagged grin crossing his face. "But I've got the most attractive, deadliest warrior in the universe with me. I like our odds." As the stray volt accelerated toward the open hangar maw of the Imperial flagship, the first orbital lance fired. A beam of pure white energy hammered into the planet below, missing the stray volt by a fraction of a mile. The shockwave rattled Silas's teeth, but he didn't blink. He was going home. And he was bringing a goddess of war with him to settle the score. The stray volt didn't land so much as it plummeted into the Eternal Wrath's primary hangar bay. Silas slammed the reverse thrusters at the last possible microsecond, the ship skidding across the polished deck in a shower of blue sparks and screaming metal. It slammed into a row of parked interceptors, coming to a bone-jarring halt right in the center of the Imperial hive. Silence followed, but only for a heartbeat. Red emergency lights began to strobe against the hangar walls. Thousands of mechanical locks hissed as automated defense turrets descended from the ceiling. Silas didn't wait for the greeting party. He grabbed his pulse repeater and a heavy satchel of magnetic charges. "Xylara, how's the core?" he asked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. She stood up, and for the first time since the crash, she looked like an Empress again. The gold light in her eyes was no longer flickering. It was a steady, blinding radiance that seemed to push back the shadows of the hangar. "It is hungry, Silas. It wants to reclaim what was taken." "Good, because we're about to kick a hornet's nest." The ramp hissed open. Outside, 3 companies of Praetorian guards were already formed up in a lethal phalanx, their shields interlocked, their rifles leveled. At the head of the formation stood Admiral Valerius. He wasn't in armor. He wore the stark, cold uniform of the Imperial High Command. He looked at Xylara, then at Silas, his expression one of profound disappointment. "Sergeant Thorne," the Admiral's voice echoed through the hangar's massive acoustics, "you have performed a miracle today. You saved a goddess. But in doing so, you have made her a liability. An Empress who relies on a human farmer is an Empress who can be broken. For the sake of the Empire, you must both be erased." "You talk a lot for a man standing in a room full of fuel lines," Silas said, stepping off the ramp. "Kill them," Valerius commanded, turning his back. The world exploded into white light. The Praetorians fired in perfect synchronization, a wall of disintegrator beams screaming toward the 2 figures. But the beams never hit. Xylara stepped in front of Silas, her hands raised. The air in front of her distorted, turning into a shimmering violet shield that absorbed the energy of 100 rifles. She wasn't just blocking the shots, she was feeding on them. The fracture in her chest pulsed with every hit, her power growing exponentially as she siphoned the Empire's own weapons against them. "My turn," she whispered. She thrust her arms outward. A kinetic shockwave of pure singularity energy tore through the hangar. The Praetorian phalanx was shattered like glass, soldiers in multi-ton power armor sent flying through the air like autumn leaves. "Go!" she shouted to Silas. "The bridge is 4 levels up. If we take the ship, we stop the sterilization of Oros 4. Silas didn't need to be told twice. He sprinted through the smoke, using the chaos Xylara was creating as cover. He was a shadow among the fire, moving with the lethal efficiency of a man who had cleared 1,000 bunkers. He reached the main elevator shaft, slapped a magnetic charge on the doors, and blew his way in. But as he climbed a service ladder toward the command deck, his comms chirped. It was a frequency he hadn't heard in years. "Sergeant, Silas." It was a weak, distorted voice. It was the Praetorian commander from the planet's surface. He had survived the blast. "You think you're winning? Look at the primary capacitor. On the Admiral's deck, Valerius isn't trying to capture her anymore. He's turned the eternal wrath into a detonator." Silas froze, his hand on the next rung. He looked at his internal scanners. The ship's main reactor wasn't just powering the lances. It was being overloaded from the bridge. Valerius was going to scuttle the flagship, the Empress, and the sergeant all at once. He was going to wipe the slate clean with a localized sun. "Xylara, it's a trap!" Silas roared into his headset. "The whole ship is the bomb." But Xylara didn't answer. Down in the hangar, the sound of combat had been replaced by a low, terrifying hum. Silas looked down the elevator shaft and saw it a web of violet energy reaching out from Xylara, connecting her to the ship's internal systems. She wasn't fighting the soldiers anymore. She was fighting the ship itself. "I know, Silas." Her voice finally came through, sounding hollow and ethereal. "I can feel the overload. I can stop it, but I have to merge with the core. I have to become the anchor. If you do that, you can't come back." Silas shouted, his heart hammering against his ribs. "You'll be part of the machine." "Then I will be the most powerful machine in the universe," she replied, a hint of her old wit returning. "Get to the bridge, Silas. Kill the Admiral. I'll hold the sun in my hands until you're done." Silas reached the final hatch. He kicked it open and stepped onto the bridge. Admiral Valerius was standing by the panoramic view screen, watching the planet below burn. He didn't even turn around. "You're too late, Sergeant. The sequence is locked. In 60 seconds, we all become starlight." Silas raised his pulse repeater, his finger on the trigger, but his eyes were fixed on the timer. 59, 58, 57. The bridge of the eternal wrath felt like the inside of a pressurized lung. The air hummed with the lethal static of a reactor on the verge of total collapse. Admiral Valerius stood there, hands clasped behind his back, staring at the fiery scars on Oros 4 as if he were watching a sunset. "You won't pull that trigger, Sergeant," Valerius said, his voice disturbingly calm. "If you kill me, the biolock on the override dies with me. The explosion becomes inevitable. We go out as martyrs for a stable galaxy. Isn't that what you soldiers always wanted? A meaningful end?" "I'm not a soldier anymore," Silas growled, the barrel of his repeater rock steady. "I'm a farmer. And I've got a real problem with people trampling on my land." Down in the hangar, the ship groaned. Xylara's voice echoed in Silas's mind, a chorus of 1,000 shimmering stars. "Silas, the pressure. I can't hold the containment much longer. You have to break the link." "Admiral," Silas said, his eyes flicking to the countdown. 015. "You think humanity is the weak link in your empire. You think our emotions are glitches, but you forgot why we survived the Void-Shatter wars. Silas didn't shoot the Admiral. He spun the rifle and slammed the butt of it into the primary cooling conduit running along the bridge floor. The reinforced glass shattered and a spray of supercooled nitrogen erupted. "What are you doing?" Valerius screamed, his composure finally breaking as the freezing mist filled the room. "I'm changing the variables," Silas yelled. He lunged forward, grabbing the Admiral's hand and slamming it onto the bioscanner. The freezing gas had fooled the sensors into thinking the Admiral's body temperature was dropping, simulating a death state. The ship's emergency safety protocols, deep-coded into the Terran-built hull, overrode the manual sabotage. The countdown froze at 0:03. Suddenly, the violet energy from below surged. Xylara didn't just hold the explosion. She reversed the flow. She forced the reactor's energy back into the storage cells, using her own body as a conductor. A blinding flash of gold light swept through the ship, knocking Silas and Valerius to the floor. When Silas opened his eyes, the bridge was silent. The sirens had stopped. The terminal read, "System stabilized." Silas stood up, his bones aching. He looked at Valerius, who was cowering against the glass, stripped of his dignity. Silas didn't even waste a word on him. He turned and ran. He sprinted back to the elevator, sliding down the cables, and raced into the hangar. The stray Volt was still there, but the hangar was empty of life. In the center of the deck stood Xylara. She wasn't glowing anymore. She looked human, or as human as a nebula-skinned goddess could look. She was breathing heavily, her shadow armor cracked and dull. "You stayed," she whispered as Silas skidded to a halt in front of her. "I had to," Silas said, offering a hand. "The harvest is coming up. I need someone who can handle the heavy lifting." Xylara took his hand, her grip still strong enough to crush steel, but her touch was warm. "The Empire will come for us, Silas. Valerius is a coward, but the others, they won't stop. Let them come," Silas said, looking up at the vastness of the hangar. "We've got a blockade runner, a singularity core, and 60 acres of red dirt that needs defending. I'd say the odds are just about even." As the stray Volt lifted off from the flagship, slipping away into the dark velvet of space before the rest of the fleet could react, Silas looked at the woman sitting next to him. She was the Empress of the Void, a warrior who could shatter worlds. And he was just a man who wanted to watch the suns rise over his fields. But as they hit the jump gate, escaping into the unknown reaches of the frontier, one thing was certain. The universe was a lot smaller than it used to be. And it belonged to them. If you enjoyed this journey through the stars, make sure to hit that like button and share this video with your fellow explorers. It really helps the channel grow. And if you want more epic tales of human grit and alien wonders, subscribe to HFY Soundscape and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what we have coming next. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next sector.